So yes, everybody in the audience, we're going to stick to the new structure again. Everyone's going to stay in the audience until our speaker and guest is ready to take questions and or contributions. That's when you should raise your hand, and we, the moderators, will bring you up to the stage. And once you've completed your submission, we will also return you back to the audience. Thank you for your cooperation. Please do ping people in because this is a very, very interesting topic.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can begin. 2 days ago, we started this series and we discussed a lot. Usually, I do record. Anytime I speak, I do record it and make it available to those who were not in the room because I don't like repeating myself. So I did record it. I can make it available to anybody who missed part one. I would speak to Madam Ellen, and then she can send you a link or broadcast it, or we'll see how you can get access to it. We stopped last 2 days with an account of heaven where Thomas is asked to build a palace for this king, and he takes the money and gives it to charity. And charity meaning that he's actually building him a better house or a mansion in the heavenlies where the king cannot access until the king is dead. I decided to give you a second account of heaven before we start today's session, where we're going to deal with the Hebrew Bible, its interpretation or its thought about life after death. And then in part 3, we'll look at the Christian text and see what they also tell us. So, the account, this second account of a near-death experience, if I can call it such, or an account of heaven, it's one by a lady, a young woman called Perpetua. She was a young Roman matron. The book, or if I should call it her diary, is called The Passion of Perpetua. Passion of Perpetua, and it was originally written in Latin. About the authenticity of this writing, it's debated. I'm not going to go into the debate because that's not the focus. But this is what the diary tells us. Perpetua was a 22-year-old recent convert to Christianity at the time of her arrest. She had recently also given birth, so her child accompanies her to prison. And she was not only the one there, she was there with a handful of other converts who were arrested as Christians in a town in North Africa. This was when there was a lot of Christian persecutions. In the diary, this young woman narrates her encounters with her pagan father. So she was a pagan and she converted to Christianity. Her father is still a pagan, and the father is trying to convince her, to renounce this Christianity stuff so that she would be freed from the prison that she's in. But she decides, no, I've converted and I'm going to go full force. So, in a dream, in prison, Perpetua sees a tall ladder leading up to heaven. The ladder was so narrow that only one person can climb it at a time. You can't have two people climb it. It was that narrow. The ladder was enormously high. You could expect that because if you have a ladder from earth going all the way to heaven, yes, it would be quite high. And attached to the ladder, the sides of the ladder, was all sorts of metal weapons. There were swords, there were spears, there were daggers, spikes, hooks. I mean, what you can think of was there. Why was it there? It was there so that if anyone tried to climb up carelessly or without paying attention, you'll be crushed. So the message there is that the path to heaven is narrow, is frightening, and is fraught with danger. One misstep and you will be cut to shreds. At the foot of the ladder, she tells us, lies an enormous dragon, which was set there to terrify and attack anyone who makes an attempt to climb. So those who like reading the book of Revelations, you would know who this dragon or what this dragon is. Now, she wants to climb. She looks up and sees one Christian companion who had already ascended the ladder. This was the gentleman who actually helped Perpetua in her conversion from paganism to Christianity. So he has already ascended the ladder and he's up top looking down from the heavenly heights. And he's urging Perpetua to come up, warning her that do not let the dragon bite you. Perpetua looks up and assures him that the dragon will not harm her in the name of Jesus Christ. Then she boldly moves to the first step and then to the next, stepping on the serpent's head as she went up. And so she ascends the ladder, avoiding all the threatening metal weapons. This is my favorite part. She narrates that when she reaches the top, she sees an immense garden. In it was a gray-haired man. He was wearing shepherd's garb, and he was milking sheep. So you have a gray-haired man. He was wearing clothing of a shepherd, and he was actually milking a sheep. In her writings, in her diary, she does not identify who this is, but we know who this is. It's supposed to be Christ or Jesus. Around the shepherds are thousands of people clad in white, who were wearing white. Others of the saved who had already made the heavenly ascent. So these are the saints who have already gone up that long ladder, avoiding all the weapons and the dragon, and they've actually successfully made it to heaven. Christ greets Perpetua and tells her he is glad she has come. He gives her milk in her cupped hands, and she drinks it while all those around her say amen. So she comes up, Christ is milking the sheep, there is milk, she puts her hands out, milk is put in her hands, her cupped hands, and then she drinks. And as she drinks, everybody standing there says amen. Now, this is symbolic. She's drinking milk because milk is nourishment given to a newborn baby. So Perpetua here is a newborn. Perpetua is now about to be born into eternal life. Then she wakes up and then she tells her brother and those who were in the prison with her the news, the good news. Not too long after that, in the diaries, Perpetua is killed, and we believe she makes this heavenly ascent. So this is another tale of heaven. What we take from her diary is that when you go to heaven, it's like a new birth. You're given milk to drink, which is symbolic. People are wearing white. They are in this garden. They have surrounded Christ, and what they are doing we really don't get an account of it. Any questions, comments on this interesting account before we move on to what the Hebrew Bible really says about heaven, hell, near-death experiences, etc.? I think Madam Ellen will bring you up on stage if you have a question. If not, I would continue.
Kindly raise your hand. Use the hand raising tool to raise your hand, and we will bring you up.
Okay, let's move on then. Now let's focus on the Hebrew text. We looked at Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh. We looked at Homer, that is the Greeks. We looked at Virgil, that is the Romans. We looked a little bit at, not a little bit, we looked extensively at some of the New Testament books that did not make it into the final canon to see all these views. We looked at some culture, the Gan people. I mentioned the Gan people. I think DJ, who was on here last 2 days, mentioned other tribes in Ghana and their view about reincarnation and stuff. Now let's move on to the Old Testament, that is the Hebrew Bible. I will start with the elite and educated authors of the text. Job, Psalms, the psalmists, and then Ecclesiastes. Let's start from there. The views of the afterlife in ancient Israel was not that much different from those found in the surrounding pagan world. The text calls them pagan. So you would think that the ancient Israelite will stand so unique from these people. But there are numerous similarities when we look at how the Hebrews understood the afterlife, death, heaven, hell. Okay. There are some striking similarities even with Greco-Roman views. With that said, I must in turn admit that though there are similarities, there are also many distinctive features of Israelite understanding of the afterlife. Just like all cultures, the ancient Israelites also understood death to be inevitable. No one can escape it. So, with that said, what is death in the Hebrew text, in the Hebrew context? For most of the Hebrew Bible, death is what happens when life leaves a person. Where does the person go afterwards? The correct answer is it depends. Why is this important? I'm going to say something that even if you don't get anything from today's session, never forget this statement. The Bible as we have it, I'm focusing on the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. Some will call it Torah or Tanakh, but I'm focusing on the Old Testament. The Bible is not a book. It's actually a library. What do I mean by that? The Bible is a collection of writings written and edited over an extensive period by people in very different situations, responding to very different issues. The text is not written by one person. It's written by a lot of people. Some agree and some disagree. This statement is extremely important. The Bible was formulated, assembled, edited, modified, censored, and transmitted by humans, different people. One would ask, does that mean the Bible is not sacred? Does it mean that makes it not holy? Not at all. The Bible is still sacred. The Bible is still holy. The Bible is still inspired. How is that possible, Rabbi? You would ask. The question I would pose after making this statement is, what is the nature of sacred canons to the modern mind? When we say something is inspired, what do we mean? Or how do we understand it today as the modern thinker? It means that it is fixed, it is static, it is unchanging. This is what makes it authoritative, because it is fixed and static. Well, interestingly enough, this is not the biblical view or the ancient view of a sacred canon. This is not what makes something sacred or holy or inspired. Because a text is inspired, it allows for continuous unfolding and development of the tradition that is in the text. So these texts that are deemed sacred, they were modified, they were revised, they were rephrased, they were updated, and then interpreted in the process of transmission and preservation. It was precisely because a canon or tradition was sacred and authoritative, was holy, was inspired. It was precisely because of it, of this, that it was important that it adapts and speak to new circumstances. Otherwise, it would appear to be relevant. So because something is inspired, you'd have to make it relevant over time. How do you do that? You change it. You modify it. You let it adapt to new circumstances or situations. So being sacred, a sacred canon doesn't mean that it is fixed. You cannot change it. No. Because it is sacred, that is why time is spent to make sure that it becomes relevant over time. Meaning that you have to modify it, you have to revise it, you have to rephrase it, you have to update it, you have to interpret it so that it can be preserved throughout time. This is what the ancient Israelites would understand as something sacred. It's completely different from what we would interpret something sacred as. This is important because I'm going to point to you views in the biblical text that don't agree. So you have to understand why they are in the same book, but they don't agree. Sometimes they challenge each other. This is why it's written by different people. Their situations were different. They had to modify some, revise some, update some, rephrase some so that it stayed relevant in their context. With this foundation, let's begin. For most of the Hebrew Bible, death is what happens when life leaves a person. Where does the person go afterwards? Like I said, it depends. What is the earliest understanding? What is the earliest thought in the Hebrew text? The person does not go someplace other than back to the dust which they came from. According to the Hebrew text, humans were originally made from dust, and that is where they return. Where does the soul go? Well, ancient Israelites did not subscribe to the view of the immortality of the soul. So in ancient Hebrew thought, there was no soul in the Greek sense. Remember what the Greeks said. When you die, your soul leaves your body, which is a shade or a shadow, and then it goes to Hades, the underworld, where it's boring, nothing happens, you're just there, it's just depressing. The Hebrew Bible doesn't agree to that. The most ancient thought of the Hebrew text doesn't agree to that. What the Greeks identify as the shade, the shadow of the person, the Hebrew text calls it nephesh. Nephesh, which is something like breath or life force. It is not a substance that can leave a person and exist independently of the body. That is not the idea of the nephesh. It is the thing that makes bodies live. When the body stops breathing, it becomes dead matter. And that was it. It just goes away. It just evaporates. It's just gone. This is the most ancient thought of the Hebrew text. Now, does the person live on in any sense? When the breath evaporates and goes, does the person live on in any sense? It also depends on which parts of the Bible you read, because there are a variety of views. The phrase used in some parts of the Hebrew Bible when a person dies is the person has gone to death. Gone to death. A term that is used almost 1,000 times in the Bible. Where is the person's final destination? The place is called Sheol. Sheol. The King James translates Sheol as hell. Very extremely misleading. It's not hell as we think hell is today. So, according to some thoughts, some Hebrew thinkers, not all agree, like I said, the final destination of a person is called Sheol. This word Sheol occurs about 60 times in the Hebrew Bible. And like I said, in no case does Sheol mean hell in the sense people mean today, a place of eternal punishment. That is not the case here. Let me state this. There is no place of eternal punishment in any passage of the entire Old Testament. No place. Nowhere in the entire Hebrew Bible is there any discussion at all of heaven and hell as a place of rewards and punishment for those who had died. Nothing. Not a single trace in the Old Testament. Sheol is also not what the Greeks call Hades. Hades is the underworld, where, according to the Greeks, when someone dies and their soul departs, that is where they go. Sheol is not Hades. The King James translates all these words as hell, so it's extremely confusing. Sheol is the grave, the pit, the 6 feet grave that is dug. That is what the Hebrew calls Sheol. It's a technical term for the place where an individual is buried. I repeat it again. Sheol, which the King James Bible translates as hell, which is extremely inaccurate, is actually the grave, is the pit. It is the technical term for the place where an individual is buried. That is Sheol. Okay. In Psalm 16, verses 10, we read, "For you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit." In Hebrew poetry, that is how they rhyme. They don't rhyme, they repeat the idea twice. So he says, "For you do not give me up to Sheol," and then he explains it in a different way, "or let your faithful one see the pit." Why the pit? Because that is what Sheol is. Psalms 49:14 says, "Like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd. Straight to the grave they descend. Sheol shall be their home." So here the synonym for Sheol are death and the grave. So some ancient Israelites, let me rephrase that. It was the authors. Some ancient Israelite authors thought of Sheol simply as the burial place for a corpse. But not all of them agreed to this. Some extended the idea into a broader metaphor for the place that people go. This is what we are told in Genesis 37. "And all of his sons and all his daughters arose to console him." This is Jacob. "But he refused to be consoled, for he said, 'Because I will descend on account of my son as a mourner to Sheol,'" that is the grave. "And his father wept with him." This is when Joseph went missing. In Genesis 42:38, we also read, "But he," which is Jacob, "said, 'My son shall not go down with you, because his brother is dead, and he alone is left. And if misfortune befalls him on the way you are going, you will bring down my gray hair in sorrow to Sheol,'" which is the grave. So Jacob believes that when he dies, he would go to Sheol. He's not talking about hell. He's talking about the pit. He's talking about the grave. The Hebrew poets say a good deal about Sheol, and none of it very good. With what they wrote, Sheol was clearly not a place of reward for the righteous. It was a realm of death, to be avoided as long as possible. This is important. You cannot escape Sheol, but what you should desire is long life so that you can avoid Sheol as long as possible. The poets tell us that Sheol is a realm where even God, that is the Hebrew God, does not interact with its inhabitants. They believed their God's interactions are entirely with the living. Sheol, therefore, was a realm of forgetfulness. When you go into the pit, you are forgotten. So the terms that they used, the poets, the Hebrew poets, used to describe Sheol are depressing. Not because there's any pain involved, but because there is nothing involved. So it looks like what Homer had mentioned from the Greek thought, that is depressing. There's nothing happening there. You're just there. It seems like this Hebrew thought leans to that idea of Homer. It's a realm of forgetfulness. God is not even present there. No one can experience the love and presence of God in Sheol or the grave, since they are cut off from the land of the living. So the psalmist in Psalms 88, verses 4 to 5, tells us, "I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, that is in Sheol, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. So this is a place where there is no remembrance, according to some of the Hebrew poets. Psalm 6 verses 5 tells us, Return, O Lord, rescue my soul, save me for the sake of your loving kindness. For there is no memory of you in death. In Sheol, who will thank you? There's no memory. Who will thank God? He's not even listening. He's not even looking there. Psalms 115:17 also says, Neither will the dead praise God, nor all those who descend into Sheol. So this is what Sheol is. The goal then is long life. It's not to escape Sheol, but rather staying alive for a long time. It was important to live a long and full life and to avoid Sheol for as long as possible. So we see the Hebrew poets regularly praising God for saving them from Sheol. Genesis 25:7 tells us, and these are the days of the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 100 years and 70 years and 5 years. And Abraham expired and died in a good old age, old and satisfied, and he was gathered to his people. Notice it didn't say Abraham went to heaven. He was gathered to his people. Where were his people? They were in Sheol. They were in the grave. They were in the pit. So the text or the poets, they are rejoicing that Abraham was kept from premature death, allowing him a long and full life. Those who do so can die content. They've escaped Sheol for a very long time. That gave them content. They have received all that they could expect before they went to Sheol, and then that was it. Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes 9:4, For whoever is joined to all the living has hope. For concerning a living dog, it is said that he is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for their remembrance is forgotten. When you enter Sheol, when you enter the pit, when you enter the grave, you are forgotten, according to Solomon. And Job, at the end of his book, we are told, Now Job lived thereafter 140 years, and he saw his sons and his sons' sons for 4 generations. I mean that he lived that long. Verse 17. Then Job died, being old and sated with days, which goes to confirm that long life, seeing your generation after generation after generation, is what gave them content. Postponing Sheol for as long as you can is what gave them content. But at the end of the day, they all ended up in Sheol, in the grave, in the pit. And according to the earliest Hebraic thought, that was it. Nothing happening there. There is no remembrance there. It was just boring. But there was no punishment and there was no pleasure. I will take questions, comments, additions before we go on to the next thought that developed in the Hebraic context.
Thank you, Rabbi. quick reset. Welcome everybody to the Spiritual Sciences group. We are delving deeper into the series on life after death with Rabbi Akwetey Amaah. Please raise your hand if you have any questions, contributions, or submissions. Kindly follow us by clicking the greenhouse on top and follow the moderators too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Betty, you have something to say. Please go ahead.
I have a quick question. So, I'm here listening, and I've listened to everything you said. So, the Sheol being a pit, where there's no memory of anything. I think, is that the reason why when people reincarnate, they don't know they have reincarnated? Is that why? I don't know if you understand my question.
Yes, I do. I I don't have a good answer for that. Um, because this is one view. There are other views that disagree with um this view. So maybe according to this view, yes. It means that
No.
if somebody subscribes to this view and the person also subscribes to reincarnation, it would explain why they forget um, everything when
Mm,
they come back on the
when
stage.
they come back. Mm.
Correct. Yes.
Because the pit is a place where there's nothing. You don't know anything. You don't remember anything. So yeah,
Correct.
that's what I think.
Correct. Yes.
I
And
just
those who
wanted
would
to
subscribe
clarify.
to this view would agree with you. Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, if there are no more questions, let's continue. So, this is one view. Like I said, the Hebrew text has a wide range of views, and we want to cover all of them before we get to the New Testament. Now, we've looked at the poets, we've looked at the psalmists. Now, let's look at the law codes, or I call it the law section of the book. The Hebrew Bible has laws, it has poetry, it has psalms, songs, it has history, and they all give us information. Let's look at the law section. When we come to the law section of the Hebrew Bible, we are commanded not to contact or interact with the dead. We are also told that we should not turn to mediums or wizards. We are told to not seek them out. We are told we should not be defiled by them in the book of Leviticus 19. The reason is because mediums and wizards were people who had powers to consult the dead for advice. When the Hebrew text talks about mediums and wizards, they're not talking about Harry Potter. They're talking about the real deal. These are not camera tricks. And I have witnessed this done back home in Ghana when mediums are consulted to actually communicate with the dead. The Ghana people have a tradition like that where they can call some of their past kings to ask them questions. The Hebrew Bible says we should not do that. It also says that no one shall be found among you who practices divination or soothsaying or sorcery or casting of spells, or those who consult ghosts or spirits, who seek oracles from the dead. This is Deuteronomy 18. So, for you to tell me not to contact the dead, then you cannot say that dead people do not exist. Obviously, dead people cannot be consulted if they no longer exist. So, whatever the elite and educated authors of Job that we've seen, the psalmist, Ecclesiastes, may have thought, other ancient Israelites believed differently. They believed the dead still do exist in some form and can communicate with the living. You don't give commands to stop something that people were not doing. This is why I mentioned earlier that the Bible is not a book, but it's a collection of writings written and edited over an extensive period of time by different people dealing and responding to different situations and having different views. So you start the book and it has this view about the afterlife, about Sheol, about death, about heaven and hell. And then as you continue reading, you see that the view changes. Somebody disagrees with the ancient understanding of the matter. We see an example of this idea, communicating with the dead, at about the 10th century. We have a different idea or a different view about Sheol, the grave. A dead person is temporarily called back to life for purposes of consultation. This is the famous story of Saul and the medium. She's called a witch. It's a bad translation. But Saul and the medium of Endor. I'm going to read it because there's a lot of things that we can glean from it about this new idea about death, Sheol, heaven, hell, and what happens. 1 Samuel 28:4. As I read, I'll pause and then point certain key aspects of the narrative out. So we read, and the Philistines gathered, 1 Samuel 28:4. And the Philistines gathered and came and encamped in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped in Gilboa. And Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, and he feared, and his heart trembled greatly. Usually, Samuel will be there, who was a prophet, and he would consult with Samuel to see whether it was ideal to go and attack the Philistines. But Samuel is dead and gone. He's been dead for a while. So Saul wants to contact his deity, which is the God of the Hebrews, to find out whether he should go into battle. Verse 6. And Saul inquired of the Lord, and the Lord did not answer, neither by dreams, nor by the Urim, nor by the prophets. The Urim are these casting of lots, the Urim and Thummim. So if you have a question, you ask, should I go to battle? The high priest takes the lots and throws it on the ground, and then it gives you a yes or a no. He couldn't get an answer through that as well. Verse 7. And Saul said to his servant, seek me a necromanceress, and I shall go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said, behold, there is no necromancers in Endor. And Saul disguised himself and donned other garments, and he went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, divine now for me with necromancy, and conjure up for me whom I shall tell you. So Saul tends not to agree with the ancient perspective of Sheol and death. If the person just disappears, if the person is in the grave or pit, doing nothing, doesn't know anything, has no memory, then Saul will not go to this length to go look for a medium to conjure somebody to come up. It means he doesn't hold to that ancient belief of the afterlife. Okay, so he says, divine now for me with necromancy, and conjure up for me whom I shall tell you. And the woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done, that he has abolished the necromancers and those who divine by the Judah bone from the land? And why do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, which is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment will happen to you for this thing. And the woman said, whom shall I conjure up for you? And he said, conjure up Samuel for me. And the woman saw Samuel when she did her ritual. What did she do? She dug the ground with a hole in the ground, and then she would pour either milk, water, alcohol, or blood, but usually is water, and then she would recite some incantations. It is believed that those in Sheol, they are thirsty. They want water. It will make sense. If you bury it in the ground and it's just dry, of course you would want water. So when you pour the water in the hole and you recite those incantations, these shades come up to try and drink. So that is how Samuel comes up. So verses 12. And the woman saw Samuel, and she cried aloud. And the woman said to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. And the king said to her, fear not, for what have you seen? And the woman said to Saul, I have seen Elohim ascending from the earth. Let me pause here. Notice she did not say that Samuel came from heaven. You would think that Samuel, being a prophet of God, when he died, he went to heaven. But the Hebrew text does not say that. The Hebrew text does not agree to that at all. Samuel is in the earth. He is in Sheol. So that is where he comes out from the earth. Now, when the text says he came from the earth, the Hebrew word is not Sheol that is used there. Eretz. Eretz means ground or the earth. So it doesn't say that he came out from Sheol. It says he came out from the earth. Okay. And he said to her, what is his form? Saul is asking the woman. Saul cannot see Samuel. That is how it works. The person performing the divination, the necromancy, can see. But the person asking for the right to be performed cannot see. They can only hear. I repeat that. And don't try this at home. With this act, when the dead person is brought up, the person performing the ritual to bring up the person who has passed sees the person, sees an image, sees the form of the dead person that has come up. The person who came to ask that this be done doesn't see the person, but rather hears the person's voice. So Saul asks, what is his form? Saul wants to make sure that it is really Samuel that has come up. And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a cloak. And the text tells us, and Saul knew that he was Samuel, and he bowed down with his face to the ground and prostrated himself. It is worth noting that this being that came up was readily recognized for who he is. He comes up as an old man wearing a robe. Why was that information enough for Saul to recognize that this is Samuel? Because the view was that you still kept your form. Remember the Greek thought that evolved, and I mentioned 2 days ago, If you had a scar on your body, the soul maintains that scar, according to the Greeks. If you had a limp, the soul maintained that limp. So here it seems as if the Hebrew text agrees with that Greek thought. They could recognize Samuel, more importantly, the robe that he wore, because when Samuel was a kid, his mother would always come yearly to bring him a new cloak. It was symbolic of Samuel, so that the form he came in was recognizable. And that was what convinced Saul that this person that actually came up is Samuel. Okay. And Samuel said to Saul, so now he's talking directly to Saul, not the necromanceress. Why have you roused me to bring me up? Now, Samuel's reaction to his calling back to life, if I can say that, is striking. He is extremely upset that Saul has interrupted his rest in Sheol. He was in a deep, dreamless sleep and was upset about being woken up. Now, his death was not awful. Where he was wasn't terrible or something to escape. What was awful, according to his statement, was being brought back to life. Sometimes most of us say that when we leave, we don't want to come back. Sometimes I tend to agree. So he is sleeping, nothing is happening. I mean, he's in a dreamless sleep, and then you wake him up and he's extremely upset. And Saul said, I am greatly distressed, and the Philistines are battling against me, and God has turned away from me, and he has not answered me anymore, neither through the prophets nor through dreams. And I have called you to let me know what I shall do. So Saul is consulting a dead person to let him know what he can do, what he should do. Should he go into battle or not? He wants consultation. He says, and I have called you to let me know what I shall do. Verse 16, and Samuel said, and why do you ask me, when the Lord has turned away from you and has become your adversary? And the Lord has done to him as he spoke to me. And the Lord has torn the kingdom from your hand and has given it to your fellow, to David, because you did not listen to the Lord's voice and you did not execute the fierceness of his wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. And the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Let's pause. Samuel seems to know the future. This dead person who has been called up seems to know the future. Where will Saul and his sons be tomorrow? Not heaven. He says, you'll be with me. That is in Sheol, in the pit, in the grave. But I think what is more stunning is Samuel knowing what will happen tomorrow. So apparently, the dead, or if I want to be specific, at least dead prophets know the future. It seems Samuel, who was said to be wise, even as a ghost, still had some wisdom. Samuel's mind is intact and knows not only the past, but also what is to come. Is that true of all the dead? The author never tells us. But apparently, it was believed by some people in ancient Israel. So, unlike the psalmist, these other Israelites thought the dead could advise the living, in part by predicting what would soon happen in their lives. This view was widespread, and it was not only unique to the author of 1 Samuel, which will be in the 10th century. We know it predates that, or it may predate that, because we find laws that forbid the living from consulting the dead. You don't make laws to forbid things no one ever does. So this was one view that came after the first view of what happened when people died in the Hebrew text. I will take questions, contributions, additions, comments before I move on to life after death in the Hebrew text.
Yeah, good evening to everybody. Good morning around and good afternoon, wherever you are that is afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Uh, Rabbi, it's interesting, you know. I'm just at the backstage. Today I want to be a very lay person and be here. So it's interesting the way you are explaining this, and I'm kind of having this feeling. If the Christendom could actually explain the Bible in the context in which you are explaining it, I don't think there will be too much confusion with this religious systems. I'm just, and whatever you are saying, I'm just linking it back to some of our traditions, like Aman Ewe. And this necromancy and stuff, we do it a lot. I've seen Gans who also do this, and even the Ashantis, they also do it. Sometimes when a person dies and they feel like they don't understand the death, they go in seeking for answers. Like when my mom died, I had an auntie who said she suspected she was killed. So they actually came to, I have to give them permission for them to go and do that. And I told them it was not of importance to me. So it's there. And I'm kind of feeling like this is the whole history of our people that you are just explaining to us. That is making death, like I said, already death is very meaningful to me. Someone like me, I don't fear death. I see death. I've come into terms with death and it's okay for me. And I just want to applaud your teachings, and I'm telling you, it's great. I'm loving it. So I will yield my mark for now. No further.
Thank you very much, Livestone GH. Thank you very much. Yes, like you said, if Christianity would explain things from its source, its context, there will not be so much confusion. But then you cannot do that, because I'll come to monotheism, the difficulties of that invention, and you see where everything goes haywire. But you do have a point there. Mr. JC, I think you want to say something. I saw your mic flashing. If you can come on the stage.
Okay, Rabbi, I first want to say thank you for the enlightenment. But my confusion is that if it is clear in the Hebrew terms that Sheol means grieve, what transformation has the word gone through that today people seem to explain it as hell? I want to understand the connection between Sheol and then hell.
Thank you, Mr. JC, for the question. So, to answer the question, you would have to be on the next session, part 3, where I would explain the where it got a little murky. So we have Sheol, and we're going to have Gehenna. Gehenna is translated as the lake of fire. Poor translation. It's, you see, sometimes you have, let's say, even in our customs, we have certain ideas that you cannot properly explain in the English language. So what you would do is you would use a word that comes as close as possible to that thought, but it doesn't really do justice to that thought. So when you take Sheol, how do you If the authors of the New Testament were Greek thinkers, how did their culture, how did their thought actually influence what they were trying to convey? We don't see the mistake of Sheol in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament. See, so part 3, I'm going to talk about Sheol, Gehenna, what they really are, and how I would say the King James Bible actually translates it as hell and confuses us a lot. But I think it's with every language, every culture, when translating it to a different language and a different culture, sometimes the nuances are lost, and you just pick a word that you're comfortable with, but sometimes or most of the times doesn't really capture the thought from the original language.
Okay, thank you.
But so I'll see you in part 3. I'll answer that question for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. JC. Awesome. Thank you all for your contributions. I'm going to move on to life after death, another view that came up after the views that I have just shared. With this, I will use one of the earliest prophets in the Hebrew Bible to explain the new thought that cropped up into the ancient Hebrew thought about the afterlife, death, Sheol, heaven, hell. And I'm going to use the 8th century BCE prophet Amos. A little cultural background or historical background to get a context. Amos was living at a time in which the original nation of Israel had been divided into two after a civil war. So now you have the northern tribe of Israel and then the southern tribe of Judah. The two neighbors, that is, family that became neighbors, the two neighbors both understood themselves to be descended from the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to be subjected to the law of Moses. But as often as happens with close relatives, there were frequent fights, and each was at each other's throat. Amos was dealing with this rivalry between the two, but there was a more bigger issue, which was an external one. The mighty nation of Assyria was on the rise and threatening to attack the territory that the Hebrews were in. Amos himself was from the south. He wasn't from the north. He was from the south. But he came into the north to make his proclamations. He came into the north to give his prophecies. The Assyrians, according to Amos, or the ancient Hebrew thought at that time, the Assyrians were being empowered by God himself. That is the God of the Hebrews. God was angry at how the northern tribe were living their lives, oppressing the poor, ignoring the needy, perpetuating injustice. Through the prophet, God reminds the people of all the disasters he had already brought upon them. Since they hadn't learned their lessons from these lesser disasters or distractions, he was compelled to make the calamity complete. I have been punishing you with all these disasters. You're still not listening. I'm going to complete it. I'm just going to wipe you out. Amos 4:12 tells us, therefore, thus I would do to you, O Israel, because I would do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. So Amos is telling the northern tribe, or Israel, yes, the northern tribe, that they should prepare to meet their God. In this context, meeting your God was not a good thing. It meant that you're going to be, it meant that God was going to bring his entire force, his entire divine power on the nation of Israel and utterly destroy it. So meeting their creator here is not that they're going to heaven to go enjoy. No, he is bringing calamity on them. He's going to destroy the northern kingdom. Clearly, in context, Amos is principally concerned not merely with the coming death of individuals. He's not speaking to individuals, but with the destruction of the nation itself. And yet, even after destruction, according to Amos, there is still hope. At the end of the book, Amos declares that after the national death will come national restoration and a new life. Amos 9:13 reads, "The time is surely coming, says the Lord, when the one who plows shall overtake the one who reaps, and the treader of grapes the one who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined city and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them upon their land, and they shall never again be plucked up out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God." So, this idea of a future restoration of the nation, not individuals, of the nation after disaster is sometimes likened to a resurrection of the dead. As we will see as we go on, this image of a national life after death was eventually taken to mean a life after death for individuals within it. Let me repeat that again. When Amos was speaking about life after death, he was talking about life after death on a national level, a national scale. They are going to be taken into exile. That means death. They are going to return back into the land. That means life. The idea was a future restoration of the nation after disaster has come. And the restoration is likened to resurrection of the dead. Eventually, this idea of the national return of not just individuals, but a group, a nation, it was eventually taken to mean a life after death for individuals within it. But this metaphorical language that the prophets used to describe this great moment of national salvation was later to take on new meaning. We see the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel actually agreeing with Amos that it was a national restoration, not an individual one. The prophet Isaiah also lived in Jerusalem at about the time of Amos, 8th century BCE. He also proclaimed the coming military disaster at the hands of the Assyrians. This is what he says in Isaiah 26:19. Your dead shall live, your corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. The word there is shades. The earth will give birth to shades, those long dead. On first reading, and if you're reading this in isolation, the verse may seem to be saying that individuals who have died will experience a resurrection. But that is not what the text is saying. When you put what Isaiah is saying in context, it makes it crystal clear that the author is talking about the redemption, that is, the return to life of the nation of Israel in metaphorical language. He says explicitly that salvation will come to Jerusalem itself after being destroyed. Isaiah 60:26-46. He says explicitly that God will bring them peace, referring to the nation, because the people have prayed to God in the midst of the affliction. It means God will therefore bring them, that is the nation, back to life. When it says, your dead shall live, your corpses shall rise. It is not speaking about individuals. It's speaking about Israel as a nation, as a whole. So just as Adam came to life from the dust, so too will the nation of Judah in itself come to life after death, after being taken to exile. So Isaiah 26:19 says, O dwellers in the dust, rejoice. Why? Because the earth will give birth to those long dead. When you read it in isolation, you come up, or you would invent a theory that is talking about individuals, but that is not the case. Ezekiel also speaks about the same thing on the national level, talking metaphorically about the nation of Israel. In Ezekiel 37, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from the graves, O my people, that is the nation of Israel, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel. So opening the graves and bringing them up is not talking about individuals that are dead. It's talking about the nation that has been exiled, and they're bringing them back. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you on your own soil, that is the land of Israel, because they are in Babylon. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act. This is speaking about the national restoration of Israel, not individual restoration. At a certain point, concerns about individual deaths became an obsession of some ancient Israelite thinkers. And what they did was they redirected the thinking about death, that is the grave, the pit, Sheol, and the national restoration as Israel to their personal identities. Now, something that the prophets prophesied nationwide, referring to a nation, now some thinkers after the prophets come on the stage and they apply them personally. They began to reapply metaphorical language of national restoration to individual resurrection. People began to think they themselves might be restored, meaning that they will be personally raised from the dead. The context. So, how did this happen? How did it change from what the prophets really meant to what this new thought that is on the stage? How did it get here? The context this new thinking took hold more firmly in was in times of serious persecution and killing, when people who suffered for their beliefs and ancestral customs and practices came to wonder how it was fair for them to suffer and die for what they knew to be right, when the wicked prospered by living in ways opposed to God. These contexts, these new situations, these new problems helped pave the way for the view that at the end of time, God will reassert his sovereignty over the world and judge the righteous and the wicked individually at the resurrection of the dead. So when the classical prophets prophesied, talking about the dead coming back to life, and they were talking about the nation of Israel, you have a new batch, not prophets, but thinkers, come on the stage and they apply, or they take what the prophets say metaphorically, disagreeing with the prophets and applying it to them individually because of the challenges, the situations that they were in. So now we see the shift of what the afterlife was going to be, what Sheol was going to be, how people would come back to life, and then that thought is going to develop further. Before I go on to how it developed, I would pause and ask if anybody has a question, contribution, comment before I rush through the rise of apocalyptic thought, because that is what came after the classical prophets had been disagreed with. Mr. Lifestone GH, I think you came up.
Yeah, Rabbi, I just wanted to do an add up. Basically, I think this session I will put my laymanship
Please
aside
do.
and add a little. Uh, the, the part where like you said, people of knowledge later on came to change most of these things. I've really had debates with side topics. When we take some topics like Isaiah chapter 53, when you look at the context of the whole thing, you realize it is not talking about a person, but it's talking about the land Israel itself. Because most times in Isaiah, when the Lord refers to Israel as his servant, and the later people that came took these words and, like you said, metaphorically decided that no, it's applied to individuals, not actually what the main text was talking about. So, like the suffering, the suffering of Christ that they've put in this Isaiah 53. I've read through the Isaiah 53, 52, 54, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 7 coming. Then you just realize anytime the Lord refers to a servant, especially in the book of Isaiah, he mainly referred to the land Israel, not a particular person. I just wanted to add this. Thank you.
Rabbi, so I think thank you for your submission. I think it puts it puts it in context about something I was some questions I've been asking myself. And I think what came to mind when you were speaking is Ezekiel 37, the account of the dry bones. And I think that answers a lot for me. Thanks for the
Very
submission.
welcome, Mr. Lawrence. Very welcome. Yes, Ezekiel 37 is a big one. When you start reading it, you don't put it in context, it can mean something else. But Ezekiel was speaking as Isaiah was speaking, and then Amos was speaking as well. So yes, you do make a good point. Thanks for the contribution. Anyone else? Okay, then I'll continue. So we have these thinkers come on the stage who disagree with the classical prophets. I'm going to talk about the rise of apocalyptic thought. I'll explain what apocalypse is as I get to the end of this submission. So after the period of the classical prophets, Judean thinkers came to imagine that, in fact, there would be life for individuals who had died. We started without that thinking. Now we are here with that thought. It's evolved. When I say classical prophets, I want to explain that the Hebrew Bible, or in the Hebrew Bible, the prophets are grouped into pre-classical and then classical. The pre-classical prophets are known for engaging in political concerns, exemplified by the prophet Elijah. They are politically concerned about what the kings are doing, what the elites are doing. The pre-classical prophets don't have any writings. We don't have any written oracles from them. The classical prophets, the difference is that we have their writings, we have their oracles, and these prophets had followers who preserved what they said. So that is the difference between the two. So after the period of the classical prophets, these thinkers, Judean thinkers, I'm saying Judean thinkers because now you have the northern tribe and then the southern tribe. The southern tribe are the Judeans. Judean thinkers came to imagine that, in fact, there would be life for the individual who had died. For them, this new thought, there was a possibility for a real, full, and abundant life beyond Sheol, beyond the pit, beyond the grave. But it was not a glorious eternity lived in the soul in heaven or a tormented existence in hell, which was attained immediately at the point of death. So they are not saying that the soul goes to heaven or the soul goes to hell. When I say hell, I'm talking about the hell that you know today, the hell you believe it is today. They are not saying that. No. It was rather the idea that at the end of time, when history and all its evil and suffering had run its course, the God of the Hebrews would vindicate himself and his people. He would reassert his sovereignty over this world and destroy everything and everyone who was opposed to him, bringing in the perfect utopian world he had originally planned, which is the Garden of Eden. So that is what they thought. There's going to be life after death. Eden is going to be restored, and that is where we are going to be. The Hebrew God would miraculously bring into this world to inhabit it. Who would inhabit it? So let me clarify that. They are not going to heaven. They are coming back to earth at the end of history. The earth is going to come back, which is Garden of Eden, and then it's going to be inhabited. Who are the inhabitants? The righteous who had lived and suffered throughout all of history. The God of the Hebrews would bring them back into their bodies, and they would live bodily, not as souls, but as humans, without any pain, without misery, without suffering, for all time, in his most glorious kingdom, not in the heavens, but here on earth. So you die, there is a holding place. At the end of time, God is going to restore this earth back to how it was in the Garden of Eden. And those that have died are going to resurrect, not go to heaven, but come back on earth in new bodies. There's not going to be pains. There's not going to be miseries. There's not going to be suffering. Nothing like that. Okay. It's not only those who died righteous that are going to be brought back to this Garden of Eden, but those who were wicked would also be brought back to life. So everyone is coming back to life. But the wicked are not raised up to enjoy the Garden of Eden. They will be raised in order to see their crimes and pay for them with a final and irreversible punishment. They will be destroyed this time for all time. This was the thought that came on the stage, challenging what the Hebrew prophets, the classical prophets, had intended. This is the doctrine of the bodily resurrection of the dead. I must say that this idea did not originate from the Christian text. No. It did not originate from Jesus. No. This idea originated about 2 centuries, 200 years before the life of Jesus. And by his day, the time of Jesus, it had become a common feature of Judean thought. It wasn't Jesus who brought it on the stage. It was there before he came. But by his day, it's become the common thought. Remember, it was a challenge against the classical prophets, what they subscribed to. Now, these new thinkers subscribe to something different. You have to push what you subscribe to the people for them to accept it. So, by the time of Jesus, this had become common, a common thought in Judean Israel. Later, at the hands of Christians, it came to be transformed into something else. Why did this rise up? The idea of a future personal resurrection, rather than what the classical prophets thought. The idea rose principally as an internal development to the response to the troubling social and political situations confronting the Judean people, confronting most specifically the Judean faithful, those who were faithful to the God of Israel. What triggered it, though? Monotheism, the idea of one God, had been invented and introduced on the stage. The idea of only one God was not an original thought of the Hebrew Bible. It was something that was invented by a certain group of Hebrews, Judeans, let me say, the elite of the Judeans. It seemed to be a beautiful idea, but it came with its problems. If there is only one God and he is in control of the world, why do the people who try to follow him suffer for it? Now you have a big problem. This new belief provided an answer to the disturbing question plaguing many thinkers devoted to a monotheistic religion. No, you create something, you want to push a new idea, which you did, but it came with its problems. The problem of suffering is not very difficult to solve for polytheists, people who believed in many gods. Anyone who believes in many gods can easily say that some of these gods are wicked, and these are the ones who create such misery in this world. They can say that easily, and they will be justified because we have evidence of good deities and bad deities. But if there is only one God, and he is both thoroughly good and ultimately sovereign, why do his chosen ones suffer? I must say, any answer you give now has been given in the past from ancient times, and it was not satisfying. When we come to the biblical context, the prophets had a solution. The answer to this question was that the people of God have sinned, and God is punishing them for it. Suffering comes from God to penalize his people for not living as they should. This view was held by each and every one of the Hebrew prophets. So we call it the prophetic or the classical view of suffering. Why are the Israelites suffering? Because they have broken God's commandment, they are not keeping the Torah, and that is why they are suffering. But this view, this prophetic view of suffering, came to be challenged by some ancient Judean thinkers. They questioned the prophetic answer to why the people of God suffer. Maybe it would make sense that God ordained the destruction of the nation of Israel at the hands of the Assyrians as a punishment for the sins of the people. Okay, we give you that, prophets. But if that's the case, why, when the people repented and returned to God's ways, doing their best to do what he demanded in his law, why then did they continue to experience social upheavals, political disasters, economic crisis, and military defeat? If you're telling me the reason why this evil is happening to us is because we are going against God's commandments, it means that when I start keeping the commandments, the pain, the suffering should go. But that was not the case. Moreover, they argued, if the key to a life happy and blessed by God is keeping his laws, then the path to pain and misery is breaking it. Why is it that wicked people prosper and the righteous suffer? Those who are not keeping it, they're doing quite well. We who are keeping it, breaking our backs to make him happy, we are suffering. To them, it would make sense if there was no God, or if there were many gods, some of whom were nasty. But now you are pushing monotheism, which says there's only one God. Now you have this huge problem to solve. How can it make sense if there's only one God who is truly good and completely in control of this world, that those who keep his commandments, do his will, are suffering? So, about 2 centuries before Jesus, they came up with a new solution. The solution was a kind of rejection of the prophetic answer. For these new thinkers, even if some suffering could come from God, it is not God who causes the problem. Instead, God has cosmic enemies. They are the ones doing it. They're developed within Judean thinking the idea that even though God is sovereign, there are other powers in the world, superhuman beings, who are responsible for persecuting and harming God's people. It was in this period that some Jewish thinkers or Judean thinkers propounded the idea that God has a cosmic antagonist, the devil. This devil entity went by different names in Judean traditions: Satan, Beelzebub, etc. The interesting thing is that you will not find this devil in the Hebrew text. He's not there. This new thought that the Judeans brought on the stage, you will not find him in the Hebrew Bible text. It's not there. We have a figure known as Hasatan, who appears in the Hebrew text in a couple of places, but most famously in the book of Job. When you read Job chapters 1 and 2, you would see Hasatan. Hasatan translates, is Hebrew, Hasatan translates in English, the adversary. This person is not the devil that you know of today. Far from it. He is one of God's, the Hebrew deity, the Hebrew God. He is one of his divine counselors who opposes humans, but who still does God's bidding. Let me explain that. This Hasatan in the Hebrew text is not Satan as you know it today. He is not the devil as you know it today. Somebody fighting against God. Not at all. Hasatan in the book of Job is an angel who works for the Hebrew God. An angel who submits to the Hebrew God. An angel who is sent on errands by the Hebrew God. And an angel who reports his deeds to the Hebrew God. He has no power outside of himself. He has to ask permission to do the bidding of the Hebrew God. This is Hasatan in the Hebrew text. The idea that the Judean thinkers brought is not found anywhere in the Hebrew text. What they did was they took, in finding answers to their new thought, they took this Hasatan in the Hebrew text and transformed him or it into a massively powerful being opposed to God and opposed to all who worship God. No, that is not the case in the Hebrew text. This is a new invention by some Judean thinkers. In the book of Job, we see the God of the Israelites seated. All the angels are gathered, and then Satan also comes in. If they are fighting, if they are at loggerheads, what is Satan doing in the council up in the heavens? If when Satan sees God, he falls down and starts shaking, why is he in the council of Elohim? Because originally, the Judean thinkers haven't taken his figure and perverted it. They haven't taken his figure as Hasatan, the adversary, given him massively powerful attributes. They haven't done that yet. But now, to answer their new thought, disagreeing with the prophetic explanation of suffering, they create this new entity who is not only opposing God, but also those who worship God. This is where the word apocalypticism comes into play. Apocalypse. It describes the Judean view that God has cosmic opponents, creating havoc on earth, destined to be destroyed in the end through a cataclysmic act of divine judgment. This word apocalypse is a Greek word which means to reveal or to unveil, to reveal what is going to happen at the end. That is why the book of Revelation is actually correctly called the Apocalypse of John. He's telling you what is going to happen in the end. So for now, what they came up with is that the devil, who is not Hasatan, is a new invention. The devil has forces who do his will. These are demonic powers that can wreak havoc on earth. All this evil comes from these adversaries of God. It doesn't come from God, because now monotheism is trying to solve a problem. For some reason, even though God is ultimately sovereign, they argue, he has ceded control of the world to these powers of evil. That is why there is so much pain, misery, and suffering here. And it is why the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper. They prosper because they side with the powers that are for now in control of this world. The righteous, on the other hand, they bear the brunt of the forces alien to God. But it will not go on like this forever. Evil, in the end, will not have the last word. God will. So these apocalypticists, those who write apocalypse, maintain that even though pain and suffering are rampant now, especially among the people of God, an end is coming soon, a time when God will reassert himself, intervene in history, and overthrow the forces of evil. There is a judgment day coming, and everyone and everything that is opposed to God will be destroyed. Those who side with God, however, will be vindicated and rewarded. A utopian world will arrive, the return of the Garden of Eden on earth. Jesus on the cross tells the thief, "Today you would be with me in paradise." The word paradise is of Persian origin, which literally means garden. So when he says you'll be with me in paradise, he's not saying you'll be with me in heaven above. He's saying that you'll be with me in the Garden of Eden, a place that is going to return back on this earth. The dead are going to arise, or they will, rise up in their bodies and live here on earth, both righteous and unrighteous. The righteous would enjoy, the unrighteous will be burnt, or they will suffer, and they will be destroyed forever, for eternity. So when this end of history comes, a utopia world will arrive, the return of the Garden of Eden on earth, literally paradise. There will be no more evil or corruption, no pain, no misery or suffering. The followers of God will enjoy eternal bliss. Most important for our discussion here, this judgment will affect not only those who are living at the time, but all people, even those who are dead. Those who have already suffered for doing what is right and died for their pains will be raised from the dead in their actual human bodies, made immortal though. So they will come back in the container, but this time that container doesn't perish, it doesn't die. In their newly embodied state, they will inherit the good world that their deity have prepared for his followers. The unrighteous, on the other hand, will be raised in order to face judgment. They will be shown the errors of their ways, be crushed by the horrible realization of what they have done, and realize that they will not receive any reward, but instead be totally and painfully destroyed. This was the thought that came after new Judean thinkers came on the stage, after monotheism has been invented with its problems. And in solving these problems, the thinkers had to disagree with the prophetic answer to suffering and then come up with this new explanation of how the righteous suffer and those who they claim are wicked are prospering. Well, it cannot be the same God that is doing it. They are cosmic forces working against this God. And to explain it further, now an entity is created, the devil, taken from a concept in the Hebrew Bible of Hasatan, and this is what we have today. Questions, contributions, additions, and then I'll do the last one, the suffering servant, and then I'll be done for today. The floor is open. Awesome. Thank you all for your contributions. I love it. That's the part I like anytime I lecture. The various understandings, the various views, because that is what makes us all learn what others know. And as you've seen, like we're doing, I'm showing you how things evolved. And when people come in and comment, you can see how actually it's still evolving. We started with one idea in the biblical text. The prophets, the poets made a claim. The prophets came and made another. Now the Judean thinkers also come and they propose something else. So we see how the afterlife, how Hades, how hell, all of this thing is evolving. I will tackle the suffering servant. I'm not doing an in-depth study on it. I just want to put it in context and also explain, use it as one biblical text that appears to have provided support for the later idea of a future personal resurrection. So the idea of the national resurrection is taken and is individualized to say that is actually talking about individuals. And I think one of the texts that was used, one of the texts that was used to support this later idea of a future or a personal resurrection of the dead is Isaiah's 52 verses 13 all the way to Isaiah's 53 verses 12, what we call the suffering servant or the songs, the 4 songs. They're actually poems, 4 poems. I won't go into detail because it's an extensive discussion if we want to look at what is going on there. So I'll summarize it. Now, when we read about the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, as most people know it, but there are actually 4 stanzas or 4 songs or 4 poems about the suffering servant. It's comparable to Ezekiel 37, as Mr. JC mentioned. I believe Mr. JC is his name. When you look at Isaiah 53, it's comparable to Ezekiel 37. The passage came to be thought as to refer, instead of the resurrection of the nation, to the resurrection of individuals. So when you read Ezekiel 37, which talks about the dry bones coming together, Ezekiel is referring to the restoration of the nation of Israel, not individuals. Isaiah 53 is also talking about the same thing. It's talking about the restoration of a nation, a people, not the restoration of an individual or individuals. But these 2 texts were taken to refer to the resurrection of individuals. And then it was further developed when the text got into the hands of Christian interpreters. They came to understand it as a prophecy of the death and resurrection of one individual, which is Jesus, who they call Messiah. Christians have long argued that Isaiah 53 is a prediction of Jesus' resurrection and then a triumph over death 3 days later. But that is almost certainly a misreading of the passage, at least as the author originally intended it to be. Most of the time, I always advise people that when you take an ancient book to read, you want to find out what the author intended to write. Those that he's writing to immediately, how would they have read the text? Would somebody living in the time of Isaiah hear Isaiah 53 and say this is talking about Messiah? Certainly not, because that was not the concept. That was not why it was written. Historically, it's certainly a misread of the passage, as has been done over time. The passage deals with the suffering servant of the Lord. But in its original context, the servant does not appear to be the Messiah. Jesus is not named in the passage. And even more striking, you don't find the word Messiah ever mentioned in there. There is a good reason for the surprise. I know those that I've spoken to, it is hard indeed for Christians to read the chapter and not think that it is speaking specifically about Jesus. No, he was despised. He was rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with infirmity. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he bore our infirmities and carried our disease. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment, his punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. When you read this, no, it seems to talk about Jesus. It seems to talk about the resurrection of a dead person. But like I said, it did not start as a resurrection of the Messiah. It started as a resurrection of individuals. That is how the Hebraic, the Judean idea formed it. And then when they cut into the hands of the Christian interpreters, it evolved even some more. So this is where we have another evidence of what happens when someone dies. There is a resurrection. Where do we get it from? They go to Isaiah 53. Now, a little comment on that, and then I would close for the day. Not only does this person who is suffering, the unnamed servant, suffer because of others, he is also vindicated by God. The main reason it is difficult for some of us to see these words and not think of individuals, not think about one particular person, which is Jesus, is because for many centuries, theologians have indeed argued that the passage is a messianic prophecy looking forward to the Christian Savior. He's going to come back, he's going to die, he's going to come back, and then what I told you about the heaven and the earth, a new kingdom, is going to play out. Anyone who is shown this for the first time, the passage in there really speaks to them. And they say, of course, it's about Jesus. Who else could it be? This is surely a prophecy of Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection, made centuries before the fact. But is that really the case? Or was that another Judean thought that came on the stage and then it was further reinterpreted to talk about a resurrection of a Messiah, the death and resurrection of the Messiah? Well, it was concluded that the Messiah had to suffer and die, but not in the traditional Hebraic sense. He was to be killed, which the Hebrews were not expecting. He was to resurrect on the third day, which the Hebrews is not in their text, and he's going to return. And when he returns, that is when you have some going to heaven, some going to hell, some going into hellfire where the worm doesn't die, the fire is unquenchable, etc. How did we get to that point in the Christian text? That would be what we'll try to cover in part 3 of this session. I will take your questions, contributions, additions before I touch on Genesis chapter 3 a little bit, and then I would give up the mic.
Rabbi, I have one question.
Sorry, Mr. Lawrence, go ahead.
Yes. For me, I think this is very informative. To be very honest with you, The first time I get to hear that the Hebrews even believed in life after death was when some Sadducees came to Jesus in Mark chapter 12. Then again, you see that these were beliefs that were held even before Jesus came into the scene. Uh, we do believe that he ushered in the New Testament, but then you get to see some of the traits of the belief system in place even before he came on the scene. So in Mark chapter 12, we see a certain group of thinkers or people who have their own beliefs even about the Torah. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and it is said that even the Sadducees did not even believe in the resurrection, which means that there were also a group of people who believed that there was the resurrection from the dead, right? So my question is, you made mention that reference is mostly made to the chapter in Isaiah, but from your own studies and from your understanding, where do you think that that set of belief evolved from? And these were even beliefs that were, I would dare say, ancient, even before the coming of Christ. Why would there be the difference in thought, and where do you think that um, thinking
Okay,
came from?
so very good question. The I try to summarize Isaiah 53 because I didn't want to go into it, but I would answer this question. Um, before the birth of Christianity, no one thought the Messiah would be someone who would die and be raised from the dead. Historically, this is almost certainly the case. The idea of a suffering Messiah is not found in any Hebraic or Judean text prior to Christianity. The idea that the Messiah had to suffer and die for others was first espoused by Christians on the basis of two facts that they knew about Jesus. He was the Messiah and he had been crucified. Their conclusion then is that the Messiah had to suffer and die. But that is not what the Hebrews believed. The Hebrews consistently believed that the Messiah would be a great and powerful ruler who delivered Israel from its oppressors. Let me focus on the word Messiah. Before the kings were called messiahs, the priests, the high priests, were messiahs. A messiah just means anointed. Anyone or anything that oil has been smeared on, also means to smear, is Messiah. So before the kings came on the stage, we had the priests. The priests were anointed, they were messiahs. Before the kings came on the stage, who became messiahs because oil is poured upon them. David, when he had the chance to kill Saul, states that I will not do that. I will not touch God's Mashiach. David addresses Saul as Messiah, and it had nothing to do with divinity, somebody who came from heaven. David is Messiah. Solomon is Messiah. Now, even Cyrus, who was not a Hebrew, was addressed as God's Messiah, God's anointed. So the idea that the Messiah had to suffer and die was problematic in the Hebrew text. The Hebrews believed they were looking for someone, a Messiah, who was going to overthrow the Roman elite, the Roman kings and governors, and then sit on the throne of Moses. He would be a mighty general or a powerful cosmic judge that's come from heaven. But he's going to be born, he's going to sit on David's throne. There is nowhere that says he's going to die and then 3 days later resurrect and then return. Yes, I would admit, different Judeans had different views of who and what the Messiah might be. But all these views had one thing in common. They all thought of the Messiah as a future figure of grandeur, one who might rule or who will rule over the nation with justice and power. Now, Jesus comes on the stage, a preacher who got on the wrong side of the law and was arrested by the enemies of Israel, that is the Romans. He was tried and publicly tortured to death by crucifixion. This was opposite of what the Messiah would be. That is why when Jesus tells Peter, I am going to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me, they're going to beat me, they're going to put me on the cross, they're going to crucify me, Peter says, no, that's not going to happen. See, that was the exact moment Peter should have said, awesome, amen, glory be to God, hallelujah, you are the Messiah, because in our Hebrew text, this is what the Messiah is supposed to do. He's supposed to come, he's supposed to suffer, he's supposed to die. But that is not what the text says. So Peter disagrees and says, no, that is not going to happen. But then Jesus turns around and says, get thee behind me, Satan. The reason why Peter protests is because that is not what the Hebrew Bible says. That was the same reason why John the Baptist, after baptizing Jesus and telling people that this is the one, they should follow him, sent messengers from prison to ask, are you really the one? Why is that? Because according to his text, the Messiah is supposed to bring salvation. Anytime the Hebrew Bible talks about salvation, it's about physical salvation, not spiritual. He's going to save the people from oppression of the Romans. So John the Baptist is confused why he is being oppressed by the Romans, and yet Mashiach is on the stage. But the Christian writers had a different view of Messiah. They came to believe Jesus was the Messiah and naturally started looking for proofs in the Bible that could support that idea. Passages that, contrary to what everyone had previously thought, might indicate that the Messiah will suffer and be raised from the dead. They used it. But previously, those reading the text wouldn't have interpreted it like that. And Isaiah 53 was a natural choice. Christian thinkers picked up the passage, promoted it as a messianic text, and that has influenced its interpretation ever since. But there are solid reasons for thinking the passage is about something else. This part of Isaiah was produced after the Babylonian armies had destroyed Jerusalem and taken large numbers of Judeans into captivity in Babylon. The exiles were suffering, and the prophet was writing in order to give them hope. that they would return. You would notice that their pains are written in the past, their glory or their peace is written in the future. But most of the time, we don't pay attention to the syntax, we don't pay attention to the context, and looking for proof text to prove that Jesus is Messiah. We do what is allowed. I must say this. Christians do what is allowed in their context, to go back, look at the Torah, and take proof text to explain their beliefs. In the Christian context, that is allowed. Jesus does that all the time. The church fathers do that all the time. But I think the scholarly and honest thing to rather do is take the Hebrew Bible, read it for what it is, its historical context, to understand what they meant when they talked about the suffering servant. We are not being true to the text when we take it from the Christian angle and then use it as proof text. We take it completely out of context. Now every verse can mean anything. So that is my long submission, Mr. Lawrence. I hope I didn't speak your ears to death.
Thank you, Rabbi. As a quick follow-up, I think one of the phrases I heard a lot was, uh, could it be the case? Could it be the case that the Hebrews read the prophecy of Jesus and they had a different interpretation or perception about how Jesus was to be born, how he was to live, how he was to die? Because if you even look through the Bible, you get to see different expectations. People hoping that Jesus was going to come as a warrior king. Jesus was going to come as a warrior, some as kings to rule. So could it be that they received the prophecy and everybody interpreted the prophecy the way they expected the prophecy to play out, taking into consideration their present situation? Because when you look at it from the Christian context, we look at all the the essential elements of Jesus's life. He was to be born, he was to do signs, he was to be crushed or to die, and he was to rule. And he'll come back and rule. So I just want to know, looking at what the expectation was in the past and now, do you think there has been a change in thinking after these scholars saw how the life of Jesus played out in line with the prophetic word? Do you think there's a difference between the expectation and now that the prophecy, some believe the prophecy has been fulfilled or Jesus has come and lived? Some believe that Jesus is the Messiah, some still don't, some are still waiting for their Messiah. But do you think there has been a change in thinking um, after Jesus came onto the scene, died, and
Um,
resurrected?
to answer that question, let me clarify this. When Isaiah and his students penned the book of Isaiah, there was no Christianity at all. So no one reading it in the context would even think about Jesus or think about a messianic prophecy. It's not there. So they will not be looking at in the context of the New Testament to understand what this text is saying. They would understand it as their prophet Isaiah is giving them hope that they will return to the land of Israel. They would not have understood it as talking about an individual coming, not at all. They would really interpret it differently. After, like I was saying, after this initial understanding of the text, the true understanding of the text, you have other Judeans coming on this stage and looking at this text and then taking it to apply to them individually, which the author did not intend. So I would say they were not using, or they were not being true to what the author intended. Like I stated again, no Judean, we have no one writing any Judean text that interpreted this as a Messiah coming in the future. It was Christians who took the biblical text looking for proof that Messiah has to die, Messiah has to resurrect. They looked at the Hebrew text to find where it said that. So my submission is, if you close the New Testament and you read the Hebrew text on its own, you won't find Jesus mentioned anywhere in the books. When the Hebrew people gave prophecies, the prophets prophesied, they were prophesying for the people in their day. That is how they would have understood it. It wasn't to the future, talking about like Christianity. No. So the Hebrews will look at it quite totally different, totally, completely different. That is why Jesus had the kind of opposition that he had. That is why the disciples had that kind of opposition that they had. You know, it was unthinkable for the Hebrew Messiah to be hanged on the tree, because it said nothing like that. But since that happened, for those who believe Jesus was Messiah, now you have to make sense of what has just happened. So you appeal to the Hebrew Bible to get proof texts of a virgin birth. He was going to suffer. He was going to do this. But when you close the New Testament, before it was written, and you read the text, you would see that there's no way you would point it to Yeshua. Impossible. Quite impossible, I must say.
Okay, Rabbi, thank you. I wish this your 30 minutes was actually 30 hours because I'm getting a lot. I'm getting a lot of questions answered, and you see, what I realized is this: the manner in which Christians adapt to the Old Testament. That is the confusion of everything. You see, Christians, when I was in church, I was at a church of Pentecost actually, and I remember debating all these so-called prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament with pastors, and it has never ended on a good note because we have been taught to actually attribute the thing as far as it fits what Jesus did. We have been taught to actually attribute it to Jesus. So starting from all the way Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, when Moses was actually looking for a successor, thou I'll give you a brethren among their own people, which some Muslims also translate to be Muhammad, coming all the way down to Isaiah 7:14, and all this stuff. I just ask myself, would the prophecy of God be so lenient in a way that the name Jesus would not even appear once in all these prophecies? Because I just realized we're just giving the verses to Jesus and taking it out of their own context. And basically, this is what Christianity taught us. So when I came back studying the ancient Hebrew on my own, and I started getting more clarity into this. Like this Isaiah 53. I was looking at the context when we were taught in church. The Isaiah chapter 52 verse 12 was never a topic of discussion. When the Lord said, my servant. You see, that was not the important part of the whole thing. The emphasis is from the 53 to 12, which is basically the suffering that is over there. But if they could have actually emphasized on the word servant, they would have realized it has got nothing to do with a Messiah coming. Because when you go to Isaiah 41, the Lord is saying, but you, Israel, you are my servant. When you go to Isaiah 44, the Lord say, Israel, remember this, remember that you are my servant. And it's all over the book of Isaiah that Israel is a servant of God. So when you get to 52, and now the same Lord is saying, my servant will suffer, why then take this? So I actually had this debate with pastors all over the church, and it seems like we're pre-programmed to just accept it. So like this Solomon's or is it David's specification of wisdom in the book of Proverbs chapter 8, verse 20 going. They tend to say that is a prophecy about the Messiah. That's a prophecy about Jesus. And I'm like, no, it's not like that. So it's basically how Christians take, like Rabbi said, so far as the things in the Old Testament, even if it's not a prophecy, that should take us to the era of Jesus, so far as it fits what Jesus does, Christians tend to take this as that is it and no further explanation. They will not go back because they'll read Isaiah 53, they'll not read 52, and they'll not read 54. They'll read Isaiah 7, they'll not read 8. And it's just like that. So basically, that's the only add up that I thought I wanted to add up.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very much.
much, Livestone GH. DJ Fuad, you could go ahead.
The book of Isaiah itself, um, but this is it. The book of Isaiah itself was written over 2 centuries, which is 200 years, to write the book of Isaiah itself. And the book of Isaiah itself is divisible into two parts. Sometimes scholars argue or divide it into three parts. We have the first Isaiah, and we have the literal Isaiah. Should we divide it into what? Into two parts. Now, the latter part was later added, which wasn't the actual original aspect of the first Isaiah or Isaiah himself. So even the book of Isaiah had later additions. So the literal Isaiah chapters are chapters 40 to 55 and also 40 to 66. You see how it is? So should we even pick the book of Isaiah? There's a great question over there, which buttresses the point of later renditions to fit into the new incoming system of the monotheistic and then the saviorship and the Christian principle to fit in. But actually, Isaiah never lived for 2 years, 200 years. I don't know if he lived for 200 years. But what he wrote was Isaiah 1 to 39, which was the first books of Isaiah. Later, did all these additions come in, which has then been taken, and also from the later additions, which came in at the latter part, is where the whole point of the Jesus principle has been taken from. So this brings a question which I always ask, and I always ask.
Thank you very
Thank us
much
all.
for that. Truth to the matter. You do speak truth to the matter. That's why I made sure that I talked about the pre-classical prophets and then the classical prophets. And Isaiah, like you accurately said, had students. First Isaiah, I subscribe to the three parts of it. First Isaiah is written by Isaiah himself. You will notice that the second Isaiah is written in a different context. The language, the vocabs, it's different, extremely different. And then the third Isaiah is also written by one of Isaiah's students. The context, the language, the words that are used in the first Isaiah, you don't see that. So you are absolutely correct that parts of the Isaiah that we ascribe to Isaiah to speak about this suffering or converting it to a messianic is actually not written by the real Isaiah. It was written by his students. And we historically we know that by the language, we know that by the syntax that is used, the context, different context altogether. So you do make a very good, accurate point, Lord Ackman. Thank you for that. And I must say this, you see, when you study the text or the Bible as a whole, in its original context, historically, archaeologically, from a critical scholarship point of view, it's completely different from when looked at it from a religious point of view. It's extremely different. A lot of questions are answered, and you are forced to be an honest person because the data that we have is different from when we teach it from a religious perspective. I mean, you are forced to come to terms and agree that sometimes these are difficult to accept. It's like, hey, you have to. But that is where the truth takes you to. Awesome. Any other questions for me before I deal with Genesis 3?
This Isaiah books, I think that it's about time we do comprehensive justice to it to clear a lot of these controversies where the issue of a young girl versus a virgin has created a whole movement for thousands of years, as Rabbi Akwetey Amaah mentioned last week on one of the groups. So I am happy to hear that quite a number of us are here and we are listening to the details of how come a young girl metamorphosed into a virgin and has given birth to Christianity, where some of our brothers don't want to take time to sincerely and critically look at the text. So I don't have much to say. I'm actually going off. My battery is disturbing me. So, Rabbi,
Thank you
thank you
very
for
much, DJ
taking us.
Fuad.
Thank
You
you very
make
much.
a good point as well. Because you brought it up, I'll put it in its historical context and explain the virgin birth. What happened? I would use layman terms to explain it. Kwame Nkrumah just took over Ghana. And the British and the French, they're coming against Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah is scared. So, the God of Ghana sends DJ Fuad. No, he's gone. Sends Livestone GH, a prophet, to go and tell Kwame Nkrumah, don't be afraid. These two nations, the British and the French, that have come against Ghana, give me about 2 years, there will be no more. Kwame Nkrumah says, okay, I've heard. As Livestone GH was leaving Kwame Nkrumah's palace, the God of Ghana speaks to Livestone GH again and says, go back to Kwame Nkrumah. The man is still scared. To make him comfortable, ask Kwame Nkrumah to ask me, God, for a sign. Livestone GH comes back to the palace at Osu and tells Kwame Nkrumah, God says you're still scared. So he wants to make sure that you're comfortable, that what he said, he's going to do it. So ask for a sign. Ask anything. Kwame Nkrumah says, no, I don't want to test God. I will not do that. So Livestone GH says, okay, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the young woman is with child. Before the woman gives birth and the child is 2 years old, these two nations, British, French, that has come against Ghana will be no more. The prophecy is supposed to put faith in the heart of Kwame Nkrumah. The prophecy has to be fulfilled in Kwame Nkrumah's lifetime. If the prophecy comes to pass in the time of Akufo-Addo, how is that a prophecy to Kwame Nkrumah? It makes no sense. So, this is the context. Isaiah tells him, was it, I forgot the name of the prophet. Will come to me. So the prophet tells him this. The prophecy, flip the page over. That is what we don't do. Flip the page over and you see the prophecy being fulfilled. It wasn't talking about Jesus 700 years later. That will not be a prophecy for Kwame Nkrumah. It makes no sense. The word used is ababawa, young woman, not virgin. The woman is the prophet's wife. His name is Emmanuel. The prophet tells us in that same book that the names of my children are signs and wonders in Israel. So the baby was born. The prophecy came to pass. Before the baby was 2 years old, British and the French Empire was destroyed. Prophecy fulfilled. Now you would say Christianity comes on the stage, trying to justify Jesus' birth. And we go to the scripture, the Old Testament, and we find this verse. I don't blame Christianity. I don't blame them. But it is argued that, okay, yes, some honest scholars will say, Christian scholars, I agree that it was the prophet's wife. The prophecy was fulfilled then at that time, but there is a dual prophecy. I don't argue that. If there is a dual prophecy, then the birth of Jesus has no uniqueness to it, because 700 years before him, there was a virgin birth. Why make a big deal about his? But you cannot have a virgin birth before Jesus. So now you have to meander your way to make things up. But no, put it in its historical context. Those who were not here last week, I'll say this and then hang up the mic. The word that is used in the Hebrew is Alma. Behold, the Alma is with child. The Alma. That word Alma means young woman. It doesn't mean virgin. If you want to address somebody as virgin in Hebrew, the word is Betula. It's interesting. Before this verse, the Bible, the same Bible, the text, had used Betula so many times before it got to this episode. If it wanted to say virgin, it would have used Betula because it is used before this word here. When it got here, if the prophet wanted to say virgin, he would have used Betula like he had used several times before here. But here, the prophet chose to use Alma, young woman. Her sexual status is not the issue here. When they were translating the Bible from Hebrew to Greek, the Greek doesn't have two words separate, young woman and then virgin. They only have one word. That one word can mean virgin. It can also mean young woman. So when they translated it to Greek, Alma became Parthenos. Parthenos in Greek can mean virgin. It can also mean young woman. The person translating from Greek to English, when he saw Parthenas, instead of going to the Hebrew that the Greek was translated from to check which word is used, they did not do their due diligence. But they already believed in the virgin birth of Jesus. So the moment they saw Parthenas, they chose the virgin meaning of the word instead of the young woman meaning of the word. Now, a scribal error has made millions, billions of people believe in the virgin birth because a scribe, based on his doctrine, chose virgin instead of young woman. So now you would notice these new Bibles that are coming out that are staying true to the text, they don't say virgin, they say young woman, because that is the accurate rendition of the text. Without any theological biases, without trying to read anything into the text, what does the narrative say? And we have to be honest when we get there and say, hey, Obi, I am a mistake, needs to be corrected. Even if it's late, we need to be honest. Now we don't have to depend on the pastor because we read the language ourselves and we can correct this. Now the new Bibles are making these corrections because somebody had an interest and then wrote it into the text. Any comments on this before I do Genesis 3 and then I run off?
Yeah, Rabbi, I was actually happy with your explanation about the Nkrumah stance that you use, and it's perfect. You just explained Isaiah 7:14 in the most perfect and simplest way that I've ever come across. And talking about that Isaiah 7:14 itself, when you look at the Bible translations, even right from the earlier ones after King James, there are some that you read that you get a clear understanding that even the young woman that we were talking about was not now going to be pregnant, but the young woman was already pregnant as at the time the prophecy was being given. When you read like the ASV, American Standard Version, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, meaning the virgin is now going to conceive. When you come to the Good News Bible, well then, the Lord himself will give you a sign. A young woman who is pregnant will have a son. And all the later versions after the Good News Bible made that same explanation that a woman was already pregnant, but was going to give a son, who was supposed to be named Emmanuel. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you.
Before we go
Go to
there,
Genesis
Mr.
3 for me.
Echo, you came up.